Hello, good afternoon to everyone. We're so excited that you're here to join us for a very important, the starter event for King's Africa Week. We are so privileged to have with us Dr. Godwin Murunga, who will be delivering this keynote lecture titled Knowledge Production, Decoloniality and Higher Education in Africa. We're also, of course, quite privileged to have with us Professor Fumi Olanishakin, who's a Vice President International here at King's College London, who will introduce Dr. Murunga first off, and then Dr. Murunga will come in and deliver his lecture. I'm going to let everyone know also that after the lecture, there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A. So please use the chat function to ask your questions, and then we'll pick those up at the end of the delivery of the lecture. I need to let everyone know also that this event is being recorded and it will go up onto YouTube once we finish the session as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We very much look forward to hearing from you later on. If I can now hand over to Professor Olanishakin.
Eka, thank you. Hi, everyone. Let me first and foremost say thank you for putting together this event. Thanks to the African Leadership Center and to the African Research Group. I've seen the whole collection of events for the week. The first time this has been done in this way. But perhaps much more importantly, it's my great pleasure to welcome to this keynote, this first of three keynotes, as I understand it, my colleague, friend, brother, Dr. Godwin Murunga. I was excited to be asked to introduce Godwin by Eka. And that's, of course, for those who don't know, you would know that Godwin Murunga is closely tied to the history of the African Leadership Center. He served as deputy director when I was director of the ALC the first few years of our founding the ALC in Nairobi. He also then moved on to become director of the African Leadership Center before moving on to head CODESRIA, our continental body. But I just, it's a pleasure to welcome him here, but I want to do the needful to give him a full introduction. So please allow me to read his bio. Dr. Murunga is a historian and political analyst of Kenyan origin. Prior to joining CODESRIA as the executive secretary, he was lecturing at the Institute of Development Studies of the University of Nairobi. He's the immediate past director, as I said earlier, of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi. I was member of the Executive Committee of CODESRIA for 2 consecutive terms from 2005 to 2011. He also has valuable teaching and management experience and a deep knowledge of the higher education landscape in Africa. And I actually think, Eka, you have made really the perfect choice by asking Godwin to do this keynote. He was, of course, a visiting professor also with us at the Global Institute, now the School of Global Affairs, as you will know it, at King's College London. From 2013 to 2016. We're still hoping to entice him back to King's in this role quite soon. Dr. Murunga has a track record of robust scholarship and exemplary leadership and has served on the boards of several research and civil society organizations, including Kenya Human Rights Commission, what is known as AROCSA, Association for Research on Civil Society in Africa. For those who don't know, and I'm very delighted about this, he was recently appointed to serve on the board of the Geneva-based United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD. Godwin, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to give this opening keynote for this year's King's Africa Week. We should have had you here in person, but this is the next best thing, and so we're delighted to have you. Thank you, Eka. Thanks, Godwin.
Thank you very much, Fumi, for the introduction. Eka for the invitation, and colleagues both at the ALC in particular and King's College for the invitation to speak at this important meeting. I noticed from the list of participants a number of friends, colleagues, comrades who we worked with for a long time, including the current director of the African Leadership Center, Shuvai. It's in some sense a sort of a reunion for me in particular. Colleagues like Modoni Wanyeki, I can see, and Awino, among others. I think it would have been an interesting moment if COVID-19 would have allowed us a moment in London, because it would have been a useful reunion after many, many years. I wanted to zero in from the broad topic to speak more particularly about the transformation agenda in African higher education. And I think that the transformation agenda is very much about decoloniality. And so I'll spend quite a bit of time reflecting on the transformation agenda, and I would like to make 2 to 3 points around this question. In making these comments, I'm really being guided by Tade Aina's Bashurum Abiola lecture, which he delivered to the African Studies Association in 2009 in New Orleans. The lecture, which is now published in the African Studies Review of 2020, is titled Beyond Reforms, the Politics of Higher Education Transformation in Africa. And I think that if we want to talk about the transformation agenda, I think sitting at the core of this is, one, the importance of zeroing in on decoloniality as a core item in any prospects for transformation. And so I would like to begin by speaking about the transformation agenda, decoloniality, and what that means for the future of higher education in Africa. Perhaps I think it's important to mention that decoloniality is not just about colonization, but it's really a disruption of old forms of colonialism and the logics of neocolonialism. It touches on a whole range of very many things, but I think at the core of this is disrupting the legacies of colonialism and neocolonialism in education in particular. I think that decoloniality also would involve a revival and introduction of forms of thought that more specifically speak to our African situations. So it is at its core a desire, to quote the title of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's 2 important books, Decolonizing the Mind and Moving the Center. Colonialism could be about the infrastructures of power relations and the exploitation and all that goes on. But as our colleague Sabelo Lovu Gasheni has argued, it is one thing to remove colonialism. It is a totally different thing, in my view and in his view, to change the mind. And at the core of the transformation agenda, there must be serious work dealing with transforming the mind, decolonizing the mind, and instituting new relations that are driven by different and new ways of thinking about our situation. So that if we have to talk about the transformation agenda, the need to disrupt is key to it. And perhaps there are 2 things that drive the desire to re-engage this issue around decoloniality and the transformation agenda. The first of these 2 things is the problem of the external location of knowledge production about Africa, and the influence of such external powers and actors who seek to control what kind of knowledge is produced about Africa. The second thing is to focus on the defects that our own higher education systems in Africa retain and have continued to reproduce over and over again, to the point where while we enjoy what one would call flag independence, within that context of that flag independence, there are being reproduced on an everyday basis forms of thought and ways of handling our situation, particularly being reproduced in the higher education sector that we need to confront. And I would like to spend a few minutes speaking about these two general challenges that have forced a good many of us to continuously mount insurgencies against persisting forms of colonialism, persisting forms of knowledge that deter the transformation agenda in higher education in Africa. The external location of knowledge production about Africa and the external influence such a power plays to control knowledge production on the continent is a key issue that we have to constantly deal with. And perhaps it's important to remember that it's something that many African scholars over generations have dealt with, that our levels of success keep on changing over time. Occasionally, the African Academy is able to push back the boundaries around which the influence of external actors is great, and occasionally when it's at its lowest level. These are struggles that, in essence, define the higher education context in Africa. And perhaps it's important to understand that the power that informs aged notions of colonialism that persist on the continent, some of this power is nested in institutions of knowledge production within Africa and abroad. So including Western universities, including associations that are involved in the generation of knowledge in Africa. This morning when I woke up, I was reviewing the African Studies Review, incidentally, where Tade Aina's lecture that I'm making reference to was published. And the first thing that I noticed was an editor's note that perhaps for the first time explicitly acknowledges that associations like the African Studies Association have been propelled by a racist logic, and that there are power relations within those associations that have made it difficult for African American scholars and African scholars to have a genuine voice in the production of knowledge about Africa. So that while we are making significant moves in the context of the Black Lives Matter moment in relation to the kind of knowledge we seek to produce, I think the acknowledgement even in the African Studies Review that these structures persist and they influence the nature of knowledge and determine to a large extent where Africans and African American academics or African scholars across the Pan-African world are located. I think that it's important to begin to center on the influence of such institutions in the production of knowledge about Africa and the extent to which it makes it difficult for us to really begin to focus clearly on the transformation agenda. Of course, one can mention a whole range of other institutions that are relevant to the reproduction of power relations that undermine the transformation agenda in the African Academy. Funding agencies that support knowledge production, but also seek to influence what kinds of knowledge are produced about Africa. Publishing and dissemination outlets that are key to who says what about Africa. And more importantly, I think policy influences that come from a whole range of other institutions, not necessarily involved in knowledge production, but actually those that are involved in knowledge validation. These are key players in the reproduction of knowledge in Africa that is externally driven. Now, there is nothing, by its very definition, there's nothing inherently wrong in knowledge coming outside Africa. But I think what the movement around decoloniality has centered on is those that have committed what has been described as epistemicide, which is destroying the knowledge basis that Africa has had over historical time and replacing it with a knowledge driven by a very Eurocentric logic, often driven by very specific ways of knowing that do not accommodate alternative or different other ways of knowing that are not Western. I think that part of the reason why the transformation agenda remains important is that these institutions, these agencies, the policy influencing institutions are very, very key to what we say about Africa, who says it, and whose knowledge is identified as being legitimate, valid, and occasionally even relevant. The second part of this point is the defects in our own higher education system. It's easy to point to external actors and identify them as actors who have made it difficult for the transformation agenda in African higher education. But our own institutions internally are caught up in a whole series of ways of knowing, ways of thinking about Africa that we need to pay attention to. And perhaps for me, there are 2 to 3 key points that I would like to zero in at this point. One gets the sense over historical time that since the attainment of flag independence, there has been the focus on the mission of higher education in Africa has either been very limited, very weak, or not sufficiently centered on the communities of knowledge and communities of action that exist on the continent. We've defined our mission for higher education in rather short-term frames. We've defined our mission for education occasionally in terms that actually undermine the very logic of what higher education is supposed to help us achieve. And so we've gone through processes of thinking about higher education, not having a long-term agenda, and therefore not being able to sustain any forms of transformation, not being able to begin to shift, to move the center as Ngugi would have it. So in the early independence era, it was about Africanization of the civil service and putting African peoples in positions that had been occupied by the exiting mainly European actors. A good objective, the nationalist movement centered on that. The urgency of that particular agenda cannot be faulted at any point. But I think that the point we may want to focus on is the point about what is the long-term agenda of higher education beyond that specific need to Africanize, to do skill development and all that. And so the consequence of that has been that we've gone through limited, uncertain, and occasionally ever-changing interest in education. The African state has moved from being one of the leading contributors to the education sector to letting the education sector go to the gutter. Across the continent, stories of horror about the extent to which we aren't paying attention to knowledge production, we aren't paying attention to the higher education system. And this has allowed our own systems to support an education system that doesn't grow the mind, that doesn't open up thinking, that equips people, that does not equip people to use knowledge to advance society. And in many cases, the desire for autonomous thought, the desire for autocentric thinking, if you will, informed by the circumstances within which we produce our knowledge on the continent, has been that which we go to last because of a whole range of important considerations relating to funding higher education, funding research and things that relate to that. In the absence of the state, especially playing a significant role in sustaining critical thinking, in sustaining the higher education sector and knowledge production that is designed to reflect the priorities of our own societies, we've opened up this space for everyone else to appear as if higher education is too important to be left to Africans alone. And I think that that is something that we have to ask ourselves. Has the higher education system in Africa really been a priority of Africans? So that when you consider these two particular points, the external point and the internal point, you notice that our desire for decoloniality, broadly understood, but colonialism, decolonizing our higher education system for transformation is caught up within what I would describe as a logic of reform rather than a logic of transformation. And I think here sits a dilemma that we need to begin to deal with as a priority. The question that I think sits at the heart then is really this. How do you aspire for transforming knowledge production? How do you aspire for what we have described as decoloniality in a higher education context that is focused merely on reform? How do you do that? How is it really, are we ready for the transformation agenda? I guess that's the point I'm asking. Everything that we have done with our higher education system over the last 3 decades has been towards reform, has been towards resisting a complete transformation that begins to change the makeup, the identity, and indeed to begin to change everything we think about in relation to knowledge about Africa. And I think for me, it is this dilemma that is important both for the issues we are talking about today, but also for the future of higher education in Africa in particular and development in general. The problem with a reform agenda is this, that a reform agenda in the African higher education sector focuses on the managerial. It's involved in tinkering with change, a change here, another one there. It avoids focusing on transforming the status quo. And the status quo of higher education is that it has too many things that are old, aged, and colonial, things that are being influenced by a package of thinking that isn't transformative in its very essence. A reform agenda is interested in a gradual and incremental change. In the process of which, of course, the danger is that there's going to be clawback, so that the danger that you are going to make 4 steps forward and 4 steps backward in the process of incremental change is something that is very much alive in those dynamics. A reform agenda avoids confronting the values and the power relations inherent in organizations and fundamental assumptions that define the very existence of our knowledge base, or in other words, even the very existence of our higher education system in general. So that there's essentially a top-down process. Change is coming from the top, even though the demands from the bottom are much more interested in the transformation agenda. It's just not possible to achieve that because change is controlled. It's driven by a desire to put in place changes that often seek to manage transformation rather than ensure that transformation happens. And therefore, the thing is that it becomes really an attempt to tinker with the higher education system instead of an overall system that, overhauling the whole education system. In the last 3 or so decades, the reform agenda in higher education in Africa has been neoliberal in content. It's been about cost saving. It's been about cost sharing. In many cases, it has argued for privatization of public goods, if you will, privatization of institutions, liberalization of institutions, all in the name of cost sharing and cost saving. This is very different from the form of education that was available in many communities in Africa in the 1960s, where education was perhaps the best and only equalizer of people from different orientations, people from different classes, people from different genders, even though the point on gender is a little bit exaggerated because institutions tended to be a little too patriarchal and masculine in orientation than this that perhaps I'm appreciating in this lecture. So that what we're dealing with here is that reform has managed transformation. It has managed to stabilize the desire of people to go the whole way, changing what they think about the higher education system. With the introduction, of course, of the private provision of higher education, in particular on the continent, but also generally private provision of education, we have created different levels of access, different levels of different knowledge that is accessible to a whole range of people. And as a result, while thinking that we are massifying education, we've ended up doing that, but also segregating those who have the capacity to access and those who have the capacity, who cannot access. So that the question of equity and equality in access to education, the question of relevance and the question of quality have, in a sense, been undermined by the very reform logic rather than being enabled by the reform logic. But in the language of those who prefer a neoliberal understanding of higher education, a neoliberal understanding of knowledge production, if you will, there is a camouflage in the language that makes everyone think that there has been a significant improvement, while what really has been done is to reform rather than transform the universities. And the result of this is that we are now moving towards a juncture in our higher education system, in our systems of knowledge production, where the pathway towards transformation are looking bleak almost every day, because we live in a world that has a pretense that the reform agenda has achieved something significant for the higher education scene in Africa. At CODESRIA, I see this every day. You receive applications for proposals from a whole range of African colleagues. They have a sound understanding of many of the issues that affect them on an everyday life, but they have a difficulty at the methodological and conceptual level of making a significant case that can be appreciated both on the continent and beyond. And so this gesturing to what we need to do, I think, is about us believing in the reform agenda rather than believing in the transformation agenda. And I think it's important that we begin to think about where we want to go forward in relation to actually transforming the higher education system and transforming knowledge production on the continent with all the infrastructure that we need to be there, but perhaps even more importantly, with a capacity to think beyond where we have so far, to admit heresy into many of the things we do, because knowledge, I think, thrives best in a state of confrontation. And I don't think we have been in a position to do this. Again, going back to Tadaina, therefore, I would like to just quote an understanding of transformation of higher education that I think is very important. A transformation agenda in the African education system would, as Tadaina puts it, refer to an intentional social, political, and intellectual project of planned change aimed at addressing historical disadvantages, inequities, and serious structural dysfunctions that are notable in our institutions of higher learning. Projects of transformation, he argues, challenge assumptions, values, and power relations, and they offer alternative visions and situations. Transformation implies practical and epistemological ruptures with previous ways of doing things and a reconstruction of structures, relations, cultures, and institutions. In the case of the African higher education, transformation entails going beyond reform. It involves a re-examination of inherited institutions and how we think about and live within them, and a reconstruction of these institutions as durable, sustainable structures geared towards meeting African needs. I am not sure that I want to push anything beyond what Tadaina has, because I think embedded in this definition is an issue that should be driving us. For instance, and Tadaina does point out this, feminist scholarship has been talking about transformation for a very, very long time. And at the core of feminist and gender theories have been put questions of relevance, questions of quality, and questions around diversities of societies. an appreciation that, you know, not only does knowledge come from particular societies and therefore being able to speak directly to the needs of those societies in their diversities, both in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of generations, if you will. But also being able to say that knowledge has to answer to the specific expectations that people bring to the table as they live their life. Borrowing from the feminist and gender theories, one can begin to see the extent to which our desire for transformation will not only be a desire to appreciate the diversities of society, but also to begin to see how we can speak relevantly to the prevailing situation within those. So an emphasis on self-reliance is key. An emphasis on autonomous growth for the higher education sector is useful. And there sits a tension there between speaking about autonomy and thinking about who funds the higher education sector in Africa. Who funds institutions like CODESRIA, for instance, that have been starved of funds from African governments, for instance, and receive funds from external agencies, many of whom, at the end of the day, we have to negotiate with them a whole range of things. The importance of self-reliance, we cannot run away from it. The late Claude, in his book on democracy and development, says the same thing. Self-reliance is at the core of development. And yet, in our higher education system has not been secured in this way, to the extent that our education systems and knowledge production institutions are negotiating what one can say and do around our own sense of who we are. But perhaps even more importantly, I think that a new set of values that define what transformation ought to look like must be at the core of this. A good many private universities, for instance, across the world are very clear about what they are doing in terms of you know, what the knowledge they impart and the knowledge they share is supposed to do. Not too many African universities are centered around discernible values that are structured and aligned through the curriculum in a way that allows anyone who attends those universities and those higher education systems to know where our biases ought to be in terms of the knowledge we produce and all that. And so beginning to think about the sets of values that we want to bring in this is important. And I'm not going to stop to end this discussion without saying that our forefathers, our mothers, founding mothers, gave us a package of Pan-African ideals that cut across the continent, but also that cut across the Pan-African world. They may not have been perfect in terms of what they articulated as core values that informed a Pan-African understanding of ourselves. But they did not have to be perfect. They left us the agenda of refining what the Pan-African values that we want to articulate are. And yet, we shop around for values that drive our identity, our knowledge, and our systems of thinking without ever making reference to the Pan-African connection that binds all of us, not just on the continent, but even beyond the continent, which means that even though I began by critiquing the external location of knowledge production in Africa, I am not oblivious of the fact that the Pan-African values that connect us sit both within Africa, but also beyond Africa. And I would say that if we are going to begin to think about a higher education system that responds to situations in Africa and in the Pan-African world, then I think we need to go back to the Pan-African discussions and ask ourselves, what are those values that find resonance with the situation that we exist in today? And part of the inspiration for this discussion, I think, is that there's that whole tradition of knowledge that we can go to. And perhaps most importantly, re-embed a culture of research, seminar, and effective publishing in the higher education system, especially within the continent, because we're doing very badly in relation to that. So to really begin to tie up this, I'd just like to say that the basics of transformation sit before us, but I think that there is a little more work that we need to do to begin to achieve this. For too long, we have been apologetic, especially Africans. We've been too apologetic about a whole range of things that everyone is not apologetic about, including our brothers, sisters in Latin America have not been apologetic about. The notion of decoloniality found its first serious expression in Latin America, right? And precisely because it found it's there, they are not apologetic about the desire for them to enjoy this. So knowledge produced by Africans is something that we need to be clear about. It's something that we need to be proud about. It's something that we need to work towards achieving. Knowledge imbued with a Pan-African sensibility is not something we ought to be ashamed of. Education as the great equalizer is not something that we should be proud of. Knowledge that is the basis for equalization of peoples, of genders, of classes, of generations, of people with different orientations, be it sexually or otherwise, is not something that we should be about. And sitting at the heart of these four things I've made is an ideological framework that gives us a sense of direction about where we want to go, about our knowledge and what we want to achieve. So I just want to conclude by saying that it is time we stopped being apologetic about some of these basic things that are important to who we are. Because if we continue being apologetic about it, we will continue losing internally because our systems are not as effective as they ought to be to compete internationally. And the external focus will persist, even though it defines us in terms of the external, not in our own terms. So I would like to conclude there by just saying that this, I think, is a useful moment for us to focus on what we want to do using a transformation agenda. Sorry, Eka Fumi, I have overshot my talk by about 7 minutes. I will shut up, and if some of the things come up, I will pick it up after this Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Godwin. That's very, very rich conversation, very, very important deliberations, exactly what we'd anticipated. It's quite certain it would be like this. Very important points to put on the table there, as we said, that should encourage us to center these conversations. I think there's a very pertinent time to be having these debates. The theme of our Africa Week has been really, it's an opportunity. You spoke about transformation as a rupture. They're having to think about it in that sense, and in a sense for many colleagues here as well who have worked on security, conflict, and have debated the way that those disruptions actually can present an opportunity for us to have very significant conversations that change, as you said, move from the short term to the long term, thinking of something that's structural. So thank you so much for that. I think central to this is reform versus transformation is the big message out of that. It's a very important point. So colleagues, I just want to encourage you, please, let's have your questions on the Q&A function here. We have a question here from Ann Pollock, who is welcoming this call for a move from reform to a transformation agenda, and is asking practical questions. What can we do? I think it's something that came to me as well. What are the specific things that academics who are based at King's, for instance, and we can perhaps extend that to colleagues based in institutions in Global North contexts, should do to contribute to this shift, including how best to support scholars on the continent that are driving a transformation agenda. As we let me see, I'm trying to see what other questions. I have another point here about perhaps speaking more to the relationship between knowledge production and African development. Very important point here on Pan-Africanism around that. So Godwin, maybe we can start with these two points. Thank you very much for these points. I see others coming in. Thank you. We'll come to those as well.
Thank you. For some strange reason, Eka, I cannot see the questions in my system on chat. So it would be nice to actually read them. But maybe I'm a bit challenged here in terms of my technology. Okay, I can see. Okay, I can see them now.
They're moving over. Thank you.
So the one question that is obviously appearing on top is the question on the relationship between knowledge production and African development, and what role does Pan-Africanism play in both. I think that part of the challenge I have is not so much whether there is a relationship, but why we haven't actually begun to identify and push for that relationship. There's a time, actually there are several times when the African Union has put in place a series of conferences to discuss the relationship between Pan-Africanism and development as the leading institution that plays a central role bringing together different African states. They have previously actually put together academics, and several times we've had this discussion about what is the relationship between knowledge production in general, but knowledge producers in particular in relation to African development. Let me put it this way. A former World Bank president once said, and I think this is very well documented, that in the 1990s, there were more external consultants in Africa than there ever were colonial administrators. Okay? There were more consultants in Africa from outside than there ever were colonial administrators. Doesn't this, in very clear terms, demonstrate what the problem is? African development is driven by policy choices that are hardly generated by African governments themselves, right? African development is driven by policies that are rarely, identified, researched, and suggested by African academics. Not because those academics are not doing their work, not because there are no institutions on the continent that are generating knowledge and policy options that are relevant for the development of Africa, but because African governments are lobbied extensively by everyone who thinks that development is such an important issue to be left to Africans alone. Now, the question then becomes, what knowledge goes into developing those policy proposals that go in? And we've had debates in Africa generally, but Kenya in particular, which is an example that I understand slightly better. The leading policy document for development in Kenya in 1965 was drafted by a Canadian consultant. And today we still deal with the consequences of what that is. So I think that we shouldn't think about the relationship between knowledge production and African development in terms of snapshots. I think we need to ask ourselves a slightly different question. What kind of knowledge is important for Africa's development? And my view coming from the social sciences is that the best way to approach knowledge production is to generate basic knowledge. To generate knowledge that provides us with an understanding of the many-sidedness of our situations. And the policy actors, therefore, are given a choice to begin to think about what are the most suitable ways thinking development, designing development policies and all that. Now, if you do not have an education sector that allows for the generation of that knowledge, then you have a problem. So for me, it's less about what others can do for Africans. It's about what Africans need to begin to do by themselves. Because if we do it ourselves, we are going to sharpen the extent to which we are going to sharpen the kind of knowledge we need in order to identify our own development priorities. And I think that would be a useful starting point, and then everyone else would fall in line. And I think that knowledge production and Pan-Africanism should not be unnecessarily divided in this analysis. I think that any knowledge that wants to think about Africa development necessarily has to be Pan-African. That doesn't mean we need one narrative of what development for Africa should be. It needs that out of many Pan-Africanism, out of one Pan-Africanism, there can be many elements of it that apply to different areas of our life in different countries and regions of the continent. I think that would be one way to go. And so here I'm actually saying that there is an element of what we can do. And I think the challenge begins first on Africans and then expands to others, but also just being able to say, go back to the point about self-reliance and say, this is what we need in terms of how we want to define our future. And also, so let me see if there is an additional question there. Eka, if you can spot any question that I need to look at, because I can see there are several comments. I would be happy to
there are.
hear.
I'm going to come
Please.
to you. And Pollock had asked about what academics based at King's, for instance, but if you think of institutions in the global north, so you made the point about self-reliance, but what can, I guess, allies do, is what I'm hearing in that question.
No, thank you, Eka, for pointing out that, you know, when you are on the strand at the campus, you look on the other side, you find London School of Economics. And you move just ahead, you find, I think it's London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and then you find SOAS, and you find all these colleges. And to be honest with you, these colleges have played a significant role in defining, directly or indirectly, the nature of African development, right? I'm thinking about a whole range of African students who have been trained in many of these places on various things. I think 2 former presidents of Kenya were at the London School of Economics. So I think it's a useful question, but one that has already begun to be answered. What's for me is most important is going to be what forms of knowledge are we imparting to the students that we are training, but more importantly, how are we preparing them with a sensitivity that they are going to start that they want to make a contribution to Africa. These are 2 questions that I think are important, and it would be wrong of me not to say that a good many African students, a good many Africans are dissatisfied with the role that many of such institutions have played. And I think the push, again, in the context of a Pan-African logic, the push for forms of knowledge, ways of doing things that are more sensitive to the continent is going to be a central defining element of what we can do. So in whichever way that we begin to think about this, the core of that is going to be to what extent are we, reflecting on Africa? Are we teaching about Africa that begins to influence in a positive way what the continent is looking for? And I have absolutely no doubt about the fact that we now are beginning to have a cohort of academics in many of these institutions that are raising significant questions about what if you will, quote unquote, the West needs to do in relation to Africa in order to facilitate more genuine, more relevant forms of development. For me, I think the challenge is going to be to sustain that movement that can allow us to refocus more on the priorities and needs of Africans than on the priorities of external actors who want to impose them on the continent.
Thanks very much for that, Godwin. So a couple more points have come through. Thanks very much, colleagues, for sharing those. We have from Modoni Wenyeki, I mean, the point you made about how knowledge thrives best in a state of confrontation. And now asking about this confrontation, the assumption is that this confrontation, your reference was not to a sort of African external, but confrontation here, you know, within the continent itself and on our own terms. So wanting to press you a bit on that. And also a point is made here. She's also struck by the link you make between external production of knowledge about Africa with external uptake imperatives. And why are our own routes to uptake so narrow?
I think, Modoni, that's a very useful question. And I think it invites us to a slightly broad and I think more important reflection. Because I think this is an area of contestation that I think there are bigger battles to be fought. Let me take a quick example. We invited Thabo Mbeki to the 15th General Assembly of CODESRIA to speak on a whole range of important things around globalization. He picked up one example, which is from his own personal experience of a president in West Africa who, when they were negotiating for trade relations with the European Union, really was interested in arguing very strongly around the agricultural priorities of his own country. And one day they woke up and he had started flip-flopping around the priorities that they had agreed on. And Becky says, I put in a call to this guy and he told me, look, I'm going to be with you, but tomorrow pressure will be put on my country with sanctions about what I can sell and cannot sell to Europe. And then I will be caught up between making a choice about the future of my country in terms of the trade relations and fighting the battle that we are fighting as a Pan-African crowd. And I think that we need a genuine conversation around this question of, external influencers, external uptake around questions of policy and all that. In many cases, I think the problem is people have to choose between the reality of, having to, on an everyday life, have trade relations, have particular sets of relations with their own, Western allies. And on the other hand, having to align themselves and accept policy uptake from within the continent. So I think for me, there is a major discussion that we need to be having around what are the best ways in which African knowledge produced by Africans or produced by allies that speak to the very priorities of the continent. What are the best ways of having influence on this? And I think that over historical time, we have had very limited instances where we have had such power in terms of our activism, in terms of our evidence, in terms of our the kind of superior knowledge that we produce that says the best options for policy uptake for our own countries are ABCD. And when we push that, it works. The examples in Ghana, for instance, when they were fighting against both American and German institutions around the Akosombo Dam, for instance, academics coming together, generating knowledge and information and putting it within policy frameworks that can be used to test the relationship that Ghana had. We've had very limited examples of this. I think the challenge is that we've not been able to do this a little more. And secondly, also, I think there is the reality that when a particular Western country is funding a development project, in any country in Africa, it comes with an arsenal of policy options generated by whoever that you don't know. This is happening a lot more with China, for instance, and it's a discussion that we need to go back to. So there are no straight answers in relation to what link can be drawn between external production of knowledge and policy uptake. But I think it is going to remain a contested terrain, and I think we can figure out ways of mounting effective challenges, especially to very obnoxious development options that have been sold to a whole range of us, and we have accepted them. At the moment, we are dealing with the research produced in the context of randomized controlled trials, for instance, doing serious damage to our own communities, going into a community, switching off water taps, and then trying to figure out through that controlled trial what is going to happen in terms of the choices that those communities are going to make. Now, if old anthropologists woke up and found that this is happening in 2020, 2019, it would be a surprise, because these are things that used to happen in the 1940s, for instance. So my sense is that it's going to remain a terrain of contest. But I think we haven't put our act together to be able to sustain the formidable fight and to open up our policy uptake systems for them to appreciate that there is something about the knowledge we produce that is a little more useful than perhaps what we get packaged from outside.
Thank you very much, Godwin. I think that nicely actually speaks to Yusuf Mahmoud's point about those who control the purse necessarily dictate the tune in terms of the pathway from reform to transformation. We have many more questions coming in. We have one here from Toyin Falala at the University of Texas. How do we shift the center of publishing to Africa? And referencing a previous intervention that you've made around this, about the resource, how the resources to publish journals in Africa are weak. How do we address this weakness? Because if not, is decoloniality itself not limited? Is the point being made?
Yeah, Toyin, I hear you. The challenge around publishing, I think, is even more significant. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, the publishing outlets for African academics in particular have dwindled, and the journals, Africa has a higher rate of journals that have volume 1, number 1, and nothing else. And I think that that is something that we need to address. But perhaps I would also say that there is an interesting example that we've experienced in CODESRIA before, and that could be a useful indicator of how we can do this. In the days when the book fair in Harare used to be an annual thing, and the academics would, congregate in Harare for the annual book fair. One of the things we discovered as CODESRIA was, participating in the book fair, was that at the moment of extreme crisis in Zimbabwe, that moment when Zimbabwean academics were being left alone as the pressure on the country was mounting and the universities were suffering, Zimbabwean academics in Zimbabwe produced a lot more in terms of their published work than many other African countries. So there is a relationship to be drawn between serious adversity and the capacity of African scholars to eke out something, even in context of adversity. The challenge is this: we know so little about that. We know so little about the knowledge that was being produced in Zimbabwe at a moment of extreme adversity. The other example we can use is Ethiopia. There is a whole rich literature being produced in Ethiopia in a language that most of us do not understand, but also do not appreciate. And so we underappreciate the forms of knowledge that are being produced in Amharic, for instance, right? And one can go on and cite many of these. So I think I would like first to say that part of the challenge of shifting the Center for Publishing in Africa is to appreciate existing forms of knowledge that may not be in a language we understand or in a format that we think is good enough, and beginning to bring that into the overall archive would in itself begin to shift the center. There is a rich literature, I'm sure Toyin knows this, in Yoruba, right? There is a rich literature in Kiswahili, Amharic. One day we woke up and a range of people were telling us they have discovered huge libraries in Timbuktu, right? Discovered was the word. And that, as a historian, that unsettles me quite a bit, because discovering when there are people who had that library and have sustained it for so long is a language that is colonial in its own orientation. So the point, I think, is, number one, we need to diversify in the sense in which your question is posed. Begin to grow outlets for publishing on the continent. That's one. But I think for us to be able to make a good case for shifting, we need to begin also to understand there is an already existing rich diversity of forms of knowledge on the continent that we haven't even begun to mine ourselves. There are colleagues who have done lots of work on a range of archives that we don't even know about. And I think that in itself will help us shift before we can even begin to say, now we want to diversify for African academics operating in the context of quote unquote modern Western forms of knowledge. We've tried this ourselves at CODESRIA, supporting a total of 6 journals, and it's not really easy to sustain it, but the struggle continues, and being able to reach out to people like yourself and others would be one way of beginning to connect the different dots that are disconnected on the continent and in the Pan-African world, and beginning to see the extent to which that massive archive that we are creating in itself has relevance and value and can speak back, if you will, in the context of decolonizing our own curriculums.
Thank you very, very much, Godwin. There's some I think I noticed 3 or 4 additional questions that are so rich that I would love to put to you. We are sadly at the end of our hour with Godwin, but I will share those questions so that we go away reflecting on some of these points nonetheless. I think a very significant one from my colleague, Wale Ismail, is about how can we talk about transformation in higher education without considering the wider context? Can we sort of, the continuities between higher education and the wider socio-political, economic context? And you referenced this a lot in your conversations, really about marketization of the higher education sector and how that has influenced the narrative on reform. But I think it's a very big point to take with us as we have this conversation. Of course, I think a very important point here also about what the work of the African Leadership Center to promote decoloniality and the knowledge imparted to the African fellows. And I would love to have engaged and address this. But again, that maybe I hope that's a conversation, whoever's written this, I can't see who did, but I hope that's a conversation we can take further and explore and discuss, and also what more we can do going forward. And a final point on your own views on pre-colonial history, which would be amazing and very much in line with the theme of this year's Africa Week. But very sadly, colleagues, I'm so sorry we're not able to address those questions directly. I hope we can pick them up nonetheless, reflect, think about them as we spend time with one another this week. With that, it's just left for me to say to Dr. Murunga, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. It has been so enlightening to draw from the well of knowledge that you've shared with us here. I think we were so keen, we're very keen that this be one of the starting points for our conversations here. I think you've set us on a fantastic path. Already, as I said, the leftover questions, these are things that we will be exploring as we go on. Actually, colleagues, come to the other sessions. We will pick up on your questions. So come and let's continue this conversation. Dr. Murunga, I thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Here with us. For this knowledge, it has been so enriching. I've learned a great deal. I dare say my colleagues have. Colleagues also, those asking questions, sharing these points, convening with us. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to hear your thoughts, and we've learned from those as well. Let me, Professor Lanisha, do you want to wrap us up with any points? Fine, okay. That's it. Colleagues, please continue to stay with us. This is the first. See, this is a lovely taster. So please see what we have to offer. See who we're bringing to you, and even listen to those who are joining and speaking. Stay with us, please. Okay. Thank you so much. Look after yourselves, and we will see you. Something is starting right now, so please join that as well. Yes. Thank you so much.